Copia Global has reportedly shut down operations in six countries after they had, started operations in the last 2 or 3 years, I think. So, first question is that what do you think are some of the challenges that could make it very difficult to build and also scale an e-commerce startup in Africa?
I, I, I think I think this is a question that a lot of us are asking. I don't know that there is one. Well, I mean, your question was what are the challenges, not what is the challenge. Um,
Yeah.
so definitely there's a strong point to be made about the influence of the space or the market in which e-commerce or digital commerce is happening, right? And how that affects whether a company survives or not, whether a business rather survives or not. Obviously, there are other factors, right? A company could not be the right, they could have a poor product, the model maybe doesn't work, maybe the problem that they're so the approach that they've taken to sort of digitizing commerce is not a great fit. Unfortunately, we a lot of what we're going to be, a lot of the conversation about digital commerce in Africa is pretty much going to still be stuck at the speculation level, right? Because even
Yeah.
for a place like Jumia, which is a public company, right, we can see outcomes. If Jumia goes on say they want to rein in costs and they are slashing costs here and there, we can see all of that. But we don't have any we don't have proper insight other than what you can just gather from observing from externally and making inferences based on financial statements and whatnot. In the case of startups, it's often worse because other than short of press releases that announce the demise or when things really get very bad or when people raise a bunch of money, it's very difficult to actually understand. To be honest, even some of these companies really find it difficult to explain their models, to explain the business. Actually, if you talk to some companies and you're trying, I mean, there's the part about a nice story about how we're digitizing commerce, and I get that. That's a narrative, but from a business perspective, it's often not very clear. But it's not something that we usually pay a lot of attention to, unfortunately, until something happens that is not good news, right? Then it becomes
Yeah.
okay, people start asking questions. But personally, I think the biggest factor regarding commerce, digital commerce in Africa, especially when it's not, when you're not selling like soft items, when you're actually selling physical stuff, is that a lot of the market is still struggling under weight of poor consumption or poor consumer power, right? So people simply do not earn enough to justify. I don't know if you call it convenience actually, right? So there's not been a
Yeah.
proper
Yeah.
connection between what does convenience really mean versus, especially when it has to do with everyday items that in this part of the world is already so broken down to like the smallest minimum. People talk about like the sachetization economy or whatnot. So when you have things that are really broken down, then ultimately what it means that the margins are very, very tiny per unit, right? So if you try to think about, okay, how do you make this work as a business and you want to do this for mass consumption, then it's very difficult. I think a greater chunk of the problem tends to lie within the fact that people just don't earn enough money to make some of these things work, right? It's not the only
Yeah.
problem. I think it's something that it's very significant. It's not obvious. Again, it's not really the only problem. And in the case of Copia, it probably is not the reason why Copia, had to struggle. There are all sorts of things. There are things like growing too fast. There are things like is this digital commerce really going to be something that's quote unquote unicorn scalable? Does it really have a path to becoming $1 billion company? Are we really going to create a $1 billion entity out of people, shopping for? What's the valuation of MTN?
MTN, I don't have that off the top of my head, but it's definitely more than a billion, of course.
Yeah, so because MTN is listed at, MTN is a 10 point something billion-dollar revenue company that was in 2018. It serves pretty much a consumer market, right?
Yeah.
I think MTN does not have a market capitalization of up to 10 billion, even though its revenue across the whole group, which is not just in Africa actually.
Yeah, 7.9 billion.
Aha, there you go. So MTN is an $8 billion business with a revenue of more than 10 billion, right? So, so when you look at some of these things, look, MTN doesn't just. I think they sold their Afghanistan business, if I'm not mistaken. But it's not just an African. Doesn't just have operations in Africa. It's not just sitting in one
Yeah.
country. It's not Copia that is in Kenya. It's not any one of these e-commerce companies. So one question that really needs to be asked is, maybe this is a crisis of expectations, right? Where if you're expecting $1 billion outcome and the market is telling you that, I'm not sure I can give you $1 billion from from trying to sell food, when a lot of people still basically don't care about your new mode of delivery. It doesn't just appeal to people. The environment is not just right. So there are lots of things that could contribute, or that contribute to the failure of e-commerce generally. But I think, again, it depends on what perspective. If you look at this and you say, okay, e-commerce businesses are failing to actually be unicorns, then maybe there's a strong failure story there, right? But maybe if we're saying, okay, are we having, is there a viable path towards e-commerce businesses that are valued at 50, 100 million, 200 million? I suspect, right, that we will
Yeah.
maybe not be having this sort of conversation, because now you have businesses that are a bit more right-sized from a valuation standpoint. So, but when you begin to drive towards these huge ambitions, then you begin to run into some sort of structural problems, that because you're in a market that has a very low purchasing power, those things, they magnify. The market basically acts as a magnifying force on the structural defects. Say you raise a
Mhm.
bunch of money, right? And this could be Copia, this could be anybody else. Again, a lot of this is conjecture, because we're not sitting inside. We're not KPMG.
Yeah.
We're not with people who are administrators and who are having to go through the whole company's operations and identify what works, what doesn't work. But say you start, this e-commerce company, and at a certain level your unit economics work, and you're actually doing well, maybe not profitable, but there's a path towards this becoming a sensible business, that can run on its own, that can do very well, probably get listed locally. But then you sort of get an infusion of capital, and this capital is priced in USD, but figuratively and literally because you raise the funds in USD, figuratively because returns are expected to be generated by a foreign. It's either you get acquired, a grand merger,
Yeah.
or you list not in your local stock exchange, because that would absolutely crash. Your local stock exchange does not even have enough liquidity. What's the market cap of the Kenyan stock exchange? Probably less than 10 billion thereabout. I'm not sure. Anyways. That was shooting from the hip. So when you have all of these kind of factors, and then you switch from doing $100 million business, and now you're running into a 1 billion, $2 billion business, you begin to make some mistakes that would not have been terrible, would not have been business defining if you were smaller, right? But because now you're bigger, you're just at a much larger scale. So everything just begins to magnify itself and maybe it begins to happen exponentially. So this is maybe one of the questions that we really need to start asking ourselves, both from investors and investment perspective. I'm sure that people are asking themselves this question, right? But then I suspect that a great deal of this is not necessarily whether or not you received venture funding or whether or not unicorn. A great deal of this is really just down to the fact that, look, from 2021, even while people were still raising at record valuations in Africa, something had changed in many African countries. You know, there was
Yeah.
an under trend. Something had changed economically. Things were beginning to look better. Look, if we were if 2021 was the same economic environment as the same economic indicators as say 2012, 2013, maybe we'll be having a different story, right? When you had a lot of
Yeah.
African economies still on a very positive growth trajectory, broadly speaking, and you had the sort of maturity of companies that we had in 2021, the sort of capital in 2021, but you had the economic environment of 2012 where things were at least looking up across the continent. I suspect that the conversation about e-commerce will be different, you know? So maybe things changed, but we didn't realize that early enough. And as a result, we didn't adjust early enough, to those realizations. Because if people just don't earn enough, they just don't spend.
Then they can't
They
spend
can't
enough.
spend
Yeah.
enough, and there are lots of other things that you could be doing very well. But those things, people, the funny thing about economics as a subject is that it's essentially a type of quantitative psychology, right? Because you're ultimately trying to understand how humans will behave, but then the more stable quantity or the more stable variable in that equation is resources. So resources can change, you can sort of predict all of that, but when it comes to how human beings sort of react to changes, so
That's
I don't
completely
live,
different.
yeah, I don't live in Nigeria. I used to live in Nigeria. I don't live in Nigeria now. Like 4 months ago, 6 months ago, I could buy a 1 week call plan for 100 minutes for 5,000 naira. So I can call my family back home, I can call friends normally, 100 minutes. MTN increased that thing to 10,000 naira for 50 minutes. Now I don't make those calls. Sometimes it's a very funny thing. Now I don't make those calls as much. I can pay that 10,000, but subconsciously it just doesn't seem that valuable anymore to me. Whereas maybe I don't want to do WhatsApp. I want to just speak to somebody at this time. Now I'm a bit more willing to wait. Now MTN is doing this because obviously Nigerian revenues and whatnot. It's a Nigerian MTN number. But I'm not in Nigeria. I'm outside of Nigeria. I'm pretty much not affected by how the Nigerian revenues are going up and down or whatnot. Like with whatever variables MTN is using to make that decision. But for that roaming product, which affects me, because they are doing a revenue thing to sort of, maybe they want to build up revenue to sort of, I don't know, bulk up what they are losing to the economic environment in the country. They've done this across board, and now it's affecting me that uses an MTN Nigerian SIM card, but not in Nigeria, and I'm reducing my consumption. And I don't think MTN accounted for that when they were doing that, because they were doing this for people in Nigeria. So it's
Yeah.
just a very, very interesting place where you have all sorts of variables. And if you don't pay a lot of attention, and even if you do pay a lot of attention, you can miss things. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, why is e-commerce not looking like it's succeeding in Africa? That's a question that we're going to really need cooperation from the founders, from the investors, to really be able to answer.
True.
And
True.
this applies to pretty much anything that you
And
want to think about.
yeah. Okay, so I mean, there's a few things to take away from that. I think it was Emeka Okoye who said we didn't really do e-commerce in Africa because the market demanded it. It was a case of this was happening in the West, and how about we just do it as well in Africa and see what happens. And so we had all of that, all the early guys, Kunga, Fari, Jumia, and the likes. But like you mentioned, there's a whole lot to be said for the economic environment that they're playing in. I mean, Jumia, for example, had their highest loss ever in 2019, just after they listed on the NYSE, and since then they've significantly cut down losses. However, they are not yet out of the waters. Right? There's still some problem there with how their long term sustainability. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. And then, are we flogging a dead horse? Are we expecting too much from African startups? I think that's the question we should probably start asking a lot more. Are we expecting too much? Because, like you mentioned, guys like MTN is like, I think it's top 10 largest companies in Africa just by revenues, and it is barely making $10 billion. So, are we expecting too much from startups in Africa? I mean, I was just checking earlier, and then the largest company in Africa by revenues is an oil company, and it's a 60 plus years company. So, are we really expecting a lot more from these guys than we should be? I know there's a conversation about technology helping to scale, but are we expecting a whole lot? I mean, if you're an investor listening to this, we should probably have a conversation about this. If you're also a founder, how is this sort of tempering your expectations around your projections? Are you revising some of your projections as a result of this? By the way, the stat I mentioned about Jumia's loss was provided by Interpoint, and you could go to the website interpoint.co to check and get a lot more about that.
Because you had mentioned something from Emeka, okay, I respect him very much, about how e-commerce in Africa was not done because the market demanded it, but because it was something that was happening in the West. I'm not sure that the market always demands things before those things come to the market. I mean, you know, um, was e-commerce demanded in the West before it was built in the West? I mean, even credit cards and debit cards, did anybody go out and say, you know what, we actually need a way to put our banking information on a piece of plastic? And then people created it? No, I don't think so. So it's perfectly fine that things come to the market before the market goes out and says we need XYZ. What the question is not whether e-commerce is demanded by the market, but whether the market is willing and able to support the again, e-commerce is pretty much a channel, a way of delivering commerce, right? The question is, does the market want convenience and all of the other things that e-commerce does for the customer? That's the actual product. The e-commerce, the particular model, whether it's B2B or B2C or B2 whatnot, is a simple channel.
To listen to the full episode of this podcast, visit podcast.techpoint.africa or search for Techpoint Africa Podcast on your favorite podcast platforms.